Stop. These movies weren't meant to be funny. So why do they feel like accidental comedies? In the 1960s, science fiction promised the future. Advanced worlds, alien life, groundbreaking ideas, but somewhere between ambition and execution, things went wrong. Really wrong. This countdown dives into 12 sci-fi films so bizarre, so poorly constructed, they cross a strange line from failure into entertainment. And one of them doesn't just collapse, it completely forgets how to be a movie. The Human Duplicators, 1965. A perfect example of a film that believes it's building tension, but somehow ends up creating comedy instead. From the very first moments, everything feels slightly misaligned. The aliens arrive with glowing eyes and rigid, unnatural movements. They're speaking in a tone that sounds less like conversation and more like someone carefully reading instructions out loud. There's no urgency in their voices, no variation in emotion, just a steady, almost mechanical delivery that immediately breaks immersion. Every interaction carries that same strange energy. Characters pause too long before responding, reactions come seconds too late, and conversations unfold at a pace that feels disconnected from the situation. Moments that should feel intense or threatening instead become awkward, stretching far beyond what the scene can support. And that's where the real train wreck begins to reveal itself. It isn't the concept that fails. The idea itself has potential, but the execution, the timing, the performances, the lack of escalation, creates a completely different experience. Yet instead of tension building, it dissolves. You don't laugh because the film tells a joke. You laugh because everything about it feels unintentionally wrong, as if the entire movie exists just slightly out of sync with itself. The Navy versus the Night Monsters, 1966. The title promises chaos, a full-scale confrontation between military forces and something unknown, something dangerous. It sets the expectation of urgency, of movement, of a threat that grows faster than anyone can control. But the movie delivers slow-moving plants. Yes, plants. These so-called monsters drift forward at a pace that feels almost polite, as if they're giving the characters time to react, reconsider, maybe even step aside. And instead of panic, that's exactly what happens. Characters don't run. They don't shout. They stand there, watching. It's reacting with mild concern, as if the situation is inconvenient rather than life-threatening. That contrast is where the film completely unravels. Every scene insists that danger is present. The dialogue tells you it's serious. The setup suggests escalation. But visually, nothing supports that tension. The threat never speeds up, never intensifies, never forces a real response. And that disconnect turns the entire experience into something unintentionally funny. Because instead of watching chaos unfold, you're watching a disaster that refuses to begin, where everything points toward urgency, but nothing ever actually moves fast enough to justify it. Voyage to the Prehistoric Planet, 1965. This feels less like a finished movie, and more like something stitched together at the last possible moment. From the very beginning, there's a sense that the pieces don't quite belong to each other. Random dinosaur footage appears without warning, cutting into space scenes that seem to follow an entirely different logic. Characters react to creatures and events that don't even share the same frame, as if they're responding to something added later. The illusion doesn't just crack, it collapses repeatedly. Editing feels inconsistent, transitions feel abrupt, and continuity becomes almost impossible to track. One moment you're in a space mission, the next you're watching prehistoric animals moving through footage that looks borrowed from somewhere else entirely. At times, it genuinely feels like two completely different films are playing at once, overlapping, interrupting each other, never fully aligning. And strangely, that confusion becomes the entertainment. You're no longer invested in the story itself. That disappears early on. Instead, your attention shifts to something else entirely, trying to understand how these pieces were assembled, how these scenes ended up together, and how the film keeps moving forward despite never fully making sense. Queen of Blood, 1966. This one tries to be serious, very serious. A mysterious alien survivor is rescued and brought aboard a spaceship, where she begins draining the life from the crew. On paper, it has all the elements of a slow-burning horror story: isolation, uncertainty, and a threat that hides in plain sight. That should be terrifying, but the film approaches everything with such restraint that the tension never fully forms. The performances remain oddly calm, even when danger becomes obvious. Characters react to life-threatening situations with controlled expressions, as if they're trying not to disturb the atmosphere, rather than survive it. And then there's the alien herself. She moves slowly, silently, almost politely. There's no sudden aggression, no sharp escalation, just a quiet, steady presence that never quite transforms into something frightening. Every moment that should build fear instead stretches into stillness. The pacing doesn't help. Scenes linger too long, conversations unfold without urgency, and the emotional weight never rises to match the situation. The result isn't horror. It's a kind of awkward suspense that keeps dissolving before it can take shape. And in that constant near miss, where tension almost builds but never does, the film slips into something unintentionally amusing without ever realizing it. Women of the Prehistoric Planet, on 1966. This film doesn't choose a direction, so it attempts all of them at once. It begins with a familiar science fiction setup, a space mission gone wrong, a crew stranded on an unfamiliar planet. But almost immediately, the film starts layering in completely different elements. Cavemen appear, creatures, and survival drama unfolds, and none of it feels connected in a meaningful way. Instead of building a single narrative, the film fragments into pieces. Scenes shift without clear transitions. Characters appear and disappear without explanation. Entire sequences feel like they belong to separate stories that were never meant to intersect. The tone moves just as unpredictably. Serious one moment, strangely detached the next. There's no consistent rhythm, but moments that should carry tension are interrupted. Developments that should matter are brushed aside. The world itself never stabilizes enough to feel real or immersive. And yet the film moves forward with complete confidence. That's what makes it so entertaining. It never pauses to question its own structure. It never acknowledges the chaos it creates. Instead, it presents every shift, every mismatch, as if it all fits perfectly together. And that confidence turns the confusion into something unexpected, not just messy, but fascinating in how boldly it refuses to make sense. The Wild, Wild Planet, 1966. Visually, this film is chaos. From the very first scene, it introduces a version of the future that feels less like a functioning world and more like a collection of conflicting ideas. The costumes are elaborate but impractical, blending styles that don't seem to belong to the same time or purpose. Bright, mismatched sets create environments that look striking at first glance, but quickly begin to feel artificial. Characters move through this world dressed like fashion experiments, rather than scientists or explorers, and that disconnect never fades. The film attempts to tell a story about artificial humans, about identity, replication, and control. But those ideas are constantly overshadowed by the visual noise surrounding them. Every scene competes for attention, not through narrative, but through design choices that don't quite align. Nothing feels grounded. Technology appears advanced, yet rarely functions in a believable way. Environments shift in tone without explanation. Even simple interactions feel staged, as if the world exists only to be observed rather than experienced. And that's where the film becomes unintentionally entertaining, because you stop trying to follow the story. Instead, you start watching the details, the costumes, the sets, the strange decisions that keep pulling you out of the narrative. It becomes less about what's happening and more about how everything looks while it's happening. Aesthetic takes over structure, and what remains is a film that doesn't collapse quietly, but spirals outward, scene by scene, into something far more chaotic than it ever intended to be. Planets Against Us, 1962. This film doesn't just feel outdated, it feels misaligned with itself. The premise suggests a large-scale cosmic threat, planets shifting, forces beyond human control, a looming disaster that should create urgency and fear. But that urgency never arrives. Instead, the film slows everything down. Characters spend most of their time explaining what's happening rather than reacting to it. Dialogue replaces action, and tension is constantly delayed by long, static conversations that repeat the same information in slightly different ways. And when something finally does happen, it feels disconnected. Reactions don't match the scale of the threat. Scenes that should feel intense are delivered with surprising calmness. Even moments of supposed danger unfold without movement or escalation. It creates a strange imbalance. The film keeps describing something massive and uncontrollable, but visually, everything feels small and contained. And that contradiction becomes unintentionally funny, because you're being told to expect chaos while watching something that barely moves forward. The stakes are enormous, but the execution remains restrained, almost hesitant. In the end, it's not the concept that fails. It's the way the film keeps building toward something larger and never quite reaches it. The Green Slime, 1968. This is where bad turns into spectacle. From the very beginning, the film introduces a space disaster scenario that should feel intense and urgent. A mission goes wrong. Something unknown is brought aboard. A contained environment becomes unstable. And then the creatures appear. Bright green, and rubbery, and impossible to take seriously. they immediately shift the tone of the entire film. Instead of fear, they create confusion. Their movements feel exaggerated, their design feels unfinished, and yet the film treats them as a genuine threat. That contrast is where everything clicks. The performances become more dramatic, reactions grow louder, the stakes are pushed higher with every scene, but nothing about the creatures supports that intensity. So the gap between what the film wants to be and what it actually is keeps widening, and that gap becomes the entertainment. You're not watching for suspense anymore. You're watching to see how far the film will push its own seriousness, while everything on screen suggests the opposite. Explosions happen, decisions are made, sacrifices are implied, but the visual reality never aligns with the emotional one. And somehow, that mismatch transforms the entire experience into something strangely enjoyable. A film that fails at fear but succeeds at being unforgettable. The Angry Red Planet, 1960. This film doesn't just try to create an alien world, it tries to filter reality itself. Nearly every scene set on Mars is covered in a heavy red tint, as if the entire environment exists behind a layer of distortion. The intention is clear: make the planet feel hostile, unfamiliar, dangerous, but the effect does something else entirely. Instead of enhancing the atmosphere, it flattens it. Details become harder to distinguish, movements lose clarity, and over time, the constant red filter starts to feel less like a creative choice and more like a visual limitation. Or then come the creatures. Strange, oversized, and often difficult to interpret, they appear suddenly and without proper build-up. The most infamous among them, the so-called hybrid creature, doesn't inspire fear as much as confusion. Its design feels exaggerated, almost abstract, making it difficult to take seriously. And yet, the film treats every encounter with complete intensity. Characters react as if they're facing something terrifying, while the visuals suggest something far less convincing. That disconnect creates a constant tension between intention and execution. The story itself moves forward, introducing dangers and obstacles, but the presentation never fully supports the stakes. Instead of immersion, you get distance. Instead of fear, you get curiosity. And gradually, that curiosity turns into amusement. And because the film never acknowledges how unusual it looks, it commits fully to its world, even as that world becomes harder and harder to take seriously. And in that complete commitment, it transforms from science fiction into something far more unpredictable. The Astro Zombies, 1968. This film feels like multiple scripts were combined, without ever deciding which one to follow. At its core, there are several ideas competing for attention. A scientist conducting dangerous experiments, a criminal element moving through its own subplot, and somewhere in between, killer robots that should serve as the central threat. Each concept, on its own, could form a complete story. But here, none of them fully connect. Scenes begin abruptly, as if they've been cut in mid-thought. Conversations start without context and end without resolution. Characters appear, deliver information, and then vanish from the narrative entirely. It's not just disjointed, it feels unfinished in a structural sense. And yet, the film keeps moving forward, as if everything is perfectly aligned. That's what makes it so fascinating, because instead of following a clear narrative, you're constantly trying to piece one together. You're searching for connections that never fully form, expecting threads to tie together that remain loose until the very end. The confusion doesn't fade. It becomes the experience. What begins as an attempt to understand the story slowly shifts into something else entirely. You're no longer watching for resolution. You're watching to see how far the film will go without ever stabilizing. And somehow, that instability becomes its most memorable feature. Santa Claus Conquers the Martians, 1964. This is not just a bad movie. It's a legendary one. The premise alone feels impossible to take seriously. Martians, who are concerned about the emotional well-being of their children, travel to Earth and decide the solution is simple: kidnap Santa Claus and bring him back to Mars. On any level, it sounds absurd. And yet, the film presents this idea with complete sincerity. There's no irony, no hesitation. Every character fully commits to the concept as if it belongs in a grounded science fiction narrative. That unwavering seriousness is what transforms the entire experience, because nothing about it feels like a joke. Even when everything suggests it should, scenes unfold with a strange confidence. Dialogue treats the situation as logical. The Martians don't question their plan. The humans don't fully challenge it. Everyone moves forward as if this bizarre scenario makes perfect sense. And that contrast is where the film becomes unforgettable. Every moment feels like it shouldn't exist, but it does. Fully realized, completely committed. The costumes, the performances, the structure, it all aligns with a reality that never quite connects to logic. What could have been a forgettable failure becomes something else entirely, not because it succeeds, but because it never recognizes its own absurdity. And in that complete lack of self-awareness, it turns into accidental comedy at its purest form. Monster A-Go-Go, 1965. This isn't just a bad movie. It's a movie that forgets how to be a movie. The story begins with a premise that suggests transformation. An astronaut returns from space, but something is wrong. His body has changed. His presence feels unstable. The film hints at something unnatural taking shape, something that could evolve into a central threat. It sets up expectation. You wait for the transformation to fully reveal itself. You expect escalation, consequences, a moment where everything comes together. But that moment never arrives. Scenes unfold with a sense of direction, but that direction never leads anywhere. Events occur without building toward a climax. Characters move through the narrative without clear purpose. The structure feels incomplete, as if key pieces are missing but never acknowledged. And then, it ends. Abruptly, without resolution, without explanation. The story doesn't conclude. It simply stops, as if the film itself has run out of material rather than reached a natural endpoint. That's what makes it so unforgettable. Not because it collapses under pressure, but because it never fully forms to begin with. The foundation is there. The setup exists. But the payoff, the essential part of any story, never materializes. And that absence becomes the defining feature. You're left not with a failed conclusion, but with something stranger, a narrative that builds expectation and then abandons it entirely. Not a story that breaks, a story that never actually finishes becoming one. Some of these films aimed for the future, others barely survived production. But all of them prove one thing: failure can be just as entertaining as success. Which one made you laugh the most? Drop it in the comments. And if you enjoy uncovering cinematic disasters like these, don't forget to like, subscribe, and stay curious.